Hi, thanks for tuning in again to check in on the progress of my big heli challenge. So far things have been going pretty well. I've got quite a few flight footages for you today, so I'm just gonna roll tape and let you watch about 15 or 20 minutes of me hovering around and learning stuff. Now come on, I wouldn't do that to you, would I? 15-20 minutes of watching me hovering is like watching paint dry. So what I did is just removed some of the clips from my flight videos where I find that I learned something super valuable. So I'm going to walk you through my 4 to 5 minutes from getting the heli set up all the way to landing it and unplugging the battery. I've learned quite a lot over the past 5 or 6 flights, so just share that information with you guys, and hopefully it'll come in handy for someone to avoid any potential disasters or mistakes while doing exactly this, which is learning to fly a big helicopter. So let's start off with the first thing that I do is to install the flight battery. The first few times I flew the heli, something didn't quite feel right and the heli kept drifting forward. Since my helicopter has a flybar, that's easily adjustable with a trim, but if you can just adjust it mechanically, it's a lot better. So all I had to do was move the flight battery back a few millimeters, and that really helped just balance the heli out in its natural mechanical state. Next thing I do is do a rain check and a control surface check. Just look over the heli to begin with, make sure the blades are not binding, they're spinning freely. Do the same thing for the tail rotor blades as well. Don't overlook those. Make sure your tail rotor blades aren't crossed over when you try to spool them up, because if they stick together you're going to burn out the servo. Somebody at the field pointed that out to me, and I'm sure that's going to save me a lot of money in the future. Save yourself a lot of grief by losing communication with the helicopter and it ending up on the ground, or worse, ending up on someone's property, or even worse than that. Just do a range check. It takes you 30 seconds, flip your transmitter to the range check mode, walk 30 paces and make sure everything's still working as it should. It'll save you a lot of money from having to rebuild the helicopter if you lose communication for it for whatever reason. And then do a control surface check as well. Make sure that forward is forward on this wash plate, left is left and right is right. Make sure you do the same thing for the rudder as well. It takes a little while to make sure that your blades are moving the right direction for your rudder, but once you get used to it, you kind of recognize which way they should go. Even if you haven't touched the heli, it's a nice thing to just make sure everything's moving smoothly as it should. Another tip to save you a lot of time and grief is to avoid flying over gravel or sandy areas. Sometimes you can't help it, but if you have the choice, move it over to a grassy place, because if it does end up tipping over, and even while it's spooling up, it's going to chuck up a lot of sand and dust, and that just gets into your gears and into all the small mechanical parts. I learned this lesson the hard way when my 130X small tiny helicopter tipped over in a baseball diamond, and I was cleaning out sand from its gears for the next 20 minutes because it would keep binding. When you do take off from grass though, one thing to consider is to not let the heli just hover over the turf while it's moving side to side, because you don't want it to get caught in a few blades of grass and then end up tipping over. So another thing I've started doing is that once its rotor head is up to speed, I just pull it up off the ground at least 6 inches, and then I get into hovering and maneuvering the helicopter from there. One really good habit that I was told a long time ago for almost anything is to have small fine movements. Even when you're just driving a car or riding a motorcycle or riding a bike for that instance, big huge changes in momentum will offset you and offset the instrument that you're on. So just small movements to get things under control and bring them to their equilibrium. One thing that I've noticed is that when I plug my flight battery in on the bench and then I move it over to the takeoff area, the gyro is going to want to readjust its tail to the last position that it remembers. So if it was pointing north on the bench, and then while you're on the takeoff pad, if it's pointing east, while you spool the heli up, the gyro is going to try to correct the heading back to north. So when you notice that, just tap the rudder a little bit to the left or right, and that will sort of reset its heading to its current position. I was a little worried when I first encountered this problem, and one of the instructors mentioned just tapping the rudder left or right, even right before spooling up the head, will have it sit tight that way. Another thing I do before takeoff is just notice the wind and the wind direction. Feel how gusty it is, and make sure you're able to fly in that sort of wind. Luckily I was with an instructor and I had lots of open space, so when I had my last flight on a fairly windy day, I was able to compensate. But I did spend almost the entire flight trying to learn how the heli reacts to big gusts of wind or downdrafts, or it getting caught in its own rotor wash and sort of just heading down towards the ground closer and closer, even though I'm giving it more throttle. So it just takes a little while to get used to that, and take a few flights if you need to adjust to how your helicopter reacts in windy conditions. So I passed a small milestone on my last flight. Given that it was such a windy day, I was trying to practice a few turns, but it wasn't quite working. So I instead just ended up trying to do a small pirouette. It sounds fancy, but essentially it means just turning the heli around a full 360 degrees. I was a little nervous, and I had to fight the urge to just bring it back with the tail facing me, but I kept at it, and I think I did pretty well. At the end, I sort of not panicked, but had a moment of let me just reset the helicopter because I don't want to lose it. And that's perfectly okay, but I did get the first taste of having the heli with nose in, and I also corrected for it drifting away from me. So that was a really good sense of accomplishment to have passed that little mental hurdle. And as I mentioned in my previous video, the trickiest part is when you are closest to the ground. So if you are taking off or landing, the chances of you striking the ground are a little bit higher. When you're trying something in the air and you still can maintain orientation but you panic, it's easy to just give it some throttle, get some altitude, and then recover. The trickiest part I'm finding is absolutely the landing portion. I had one close call a few days ago where I brought it in, I was slowly throttling down, and the heli started to tip towards the right. I panicked, I wasn't quite sure what to do, but instinct kicked in and I just said, I need to take off and I'm going to try it again. So I gave it throttle, took off, and then came back for a second try. And it worked out. Again, landing on that windy day, it was starting to tip over to one direction, so as I was spooling down, I gave it a little bit of left rudder just to set it back down on both its skids evenly. So I hope you picked up any important tips that might help you while you're learning to fly the big helicopters. If you do so, leave some comments below. I'd love to hear what you think of these videos. And if there's something you're curious about how I overcame certain things, although I'm not very far into my journey yet, leave a comment and I'll do my best to address it in the next videos. Thanks again for watching. Cheers.